When I record these intros, my goal is to give you a preview of what's to come in the episode, mention the guest's name, add a few bullet points, maybe say something clever if I can, get in, get out, and leave you with a summary, hopefully one that you find descriptive and useful. Should they be shorter, longer? We get a mix of listener feedback on that, and not everyone agrees. This is Data Skeptic Consensus, and the 23rd installment in our series about how multi-agent systems achieve collective decision-making. Today on the show, I speak with Marjan Terhova about the recent paper, What Makes a Good Summary? Reconsidering the Focus of Automated Summarization.
My name is Marjan Terhova, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. My main research is focused on natural language processing and information retrieval, and I'm especially interested in how we can learn from humans and human cognition to improve our AI models. Before that, I did my master's degree in artificial intelligence and my bachelor's degree in linguistics, so I like to take the knowledge I also have from that background and apply it to my current research.
Everything I've done related to natural language processing carries with it a sort of computer science bias towards it. I don't have your background in linguistics. What advantages does that give you in your approaches to natural language processing?
It's quite interesting. We've seen the development from the early days, I would say, where linguistics was quite prominent. When we wanted to model language, people really looked into specific linguistic structures and all these kinds of things. Then we went into an era where people threw all that away, basically. No linguistics was needed anymore, and it was like data only, and we only want to learn patterns from data. And now we see a bit of a shift back again. So people try to incorporate knowledge from linguistics into the models with the idea that they can't maybe learn everything from data per se, or if we have linguistic knowledge, that might give us an advantage if we decide like these are models that could work well for this task, for example. It's a pretty exciting thing to see that we go back and that the knowledge is a bit more useful again.
Definitely. There have been a couple people who have taken a pretty provocative or extreme point of view on this.
Yeah, this from IBM has this famous quote.
Yes, I believe Frederick Jelinek said, every time I fire a linguist, the performance of the speech recognizer goes up.
Exactly, yeah.
So I imagine that was a deliberately provocative statement to make. In your experience, how have these communities actually overlapped?
Well, I mean, in the AI community or NLP community specifically, we want to model language. And that's basically what you also want to do in linguistics. You want to model language and you want to understand language. You may not want to produce language so much as a linguist, rather observe. Whereas from NLP perspective, you might want to produce it, but also understand it, right? So I think as a linguist, you have certain intuitions about language that not everyone might have that seem very obvious to you as a linguist that other people might not find so obvious, such as negation can be a hard problem to solve. For me, it seems very obvious because this is a trend we see in linguistics. But from a computer science perspective, if you've never thought about this, you might wonder, why does my model not perform well on these types of input or questions or whatever? And you might not really realize that it was about a negation or something like this.
Yeah, it wasn't really that long ago when people still seriously considered that we could solve negation with just a couple of handcrafted rules.
Yeah, exactly. There's more to that, right? So I think in order to understand what would work well or why something doesn't work well yet, linguistic knowledge really comes in handy.
Well, your paper that caught my attention is titled, What Makes a Good Summary? Reconsidering the Focus of Automatic Summarization. Now, automatic summarization is kind of interesting in that by hearing it, even if you've never heard of this field before, you kind of intuitively know what it's all about. Yet there's still some open questions. Practically speaking, what does it mean to do summarization? Could you perhaps give us a survey or overview of the various techniques?
It's a great question and maybe not so clear, which is one of the reasons why we started to write this paper. But that said, I can give an overview first of what is often kind of perceived as the way to do it in the community. So I'm talking about text summarization now, right? Because there's also a field of like video summarization, for example. But for text summarization, what you often do is like you take a input document, a text article, for example, a news article or a bunch of news articles or Wikipedia articles, and you want to kind of get the gist out of this input and write like a few sentence summary about it. That is like the majority of work that is done. Now, how is this done? With anything, we've seen a lot of progress there. So it started off with like unsupervised kind of graph-based models such as TextRank or LexRank, where basically people make a graph of the input document and then kind of see what are the most important sentences. And then we extract those. And now with the rise of neural models, we see that there is much more sequence-to-sequence approaches that people use first, like with RNNs. And now we see a lot of transformers and BERT and BART-like models popping up in the community. And then you also asked about the evaluation. So how we often do it is there are a few forms of evaluation. So you have like the automated form, and often people use Rouge, which basically checks for lexical overlap. So you have your label summary, like the one you know it should be, and then you kind of check like how many words are in common with the summary I produced, or how many n-grams to make it a bit more precise. And then there is also some new metrics such as like BERT score is a new one that doesn't measure lexical similarity, but rather semantic similarity, right? Because in this lexical similarity approach, if you have a word that is kind of the same word as in the summary that was the label, but it's not the same word, you're out. And you don't really want that. So you rather want to measure semantic similarity. So that's another type of scoring functions people use. And then another way is with human evaluation. So you would ask people questions like, which of these summaries is more fluent, or which one is more informative, or which one has the best coverage, these kinds of questions.
So my personal experience with automatic summarization, and I have not done anywhere near as extensive or thorough of a study as you had, but just anecdotally, I've used it here or there when it was in some software I was writing in, or just convenient, or trying things out. If I'm trying to be kind, I guess I might say I was not impressed. Do you find that that's a universal experience, or maybe was I just not using the state of the art?
I'm not sure which ones you've used, but one thing that I didn't mention is there is a difference between abstractive and extractive summarization. So in extractive summarization, you kind of literally take pieces, often sentences from the input document, and these are then kind of pasted into your summary. And you also have abstractive summarization, where the model just actually makes the language itself.
Ah, that's a very interesting distinction. Yeah, my experience was definitely with extractive summarization, because it just took snippets from the overall document, which is definitely limiting. Yeah, it's an abstractive summary is what I guess I was hoping for deep down.
Yeah, so what you often see, especially with a bit earlier models, is that extractive summarization gets a pretty good feeling for grammaticality and such, right? Because it's just literal sentences from the input text. Whereas with abstractive summarization, a model could do whatever and also make all kinds of grammatical mistakes that we as humans wouldn't make. Now, of course, with all the new developments around language models, this gets better and better. But one problem that we have at this point is that models, as we call it, hallucinate. So they come up with what some people would call alternative facts, maybe. So things that are not true, right? And this can range from a football team that won, whereas it actually lost, but it can also be much worse. So this is definitely a problem that we need to solve. But I don't know for you, if you say I was not impressed, what was your main issue?
Well, I guess keeping in mind that I knew I was dealing with extractive summarization, so I was only going to get back snippets of the document itself, I guess I just felt like the choices were kind of random. I didn't see the logic in why those selections were made.
Yeah, this can very well happen. There is also another issue that many of these systems are, for example, trained, like again, I don't know which ones you use, but maybe they're trained on news articles. And in news articles, we have what we call this position bias. So a lot of the important information is at the beginning of the news article. So if you, for example, just take the first 3 sentences from a news article, that already gives a pretty good baseline that is pretty hard to beat. And if you have a model trained on that, and then you maybe put something else in there, which is not news, might come up with, for what sounds to you as pretty random sentences.
Interesting. Yeah, if it's trained on news, there'd be maybe a certain bias. And also, perhaps I should confess, I was really trying to summarize some of my own writing. So, maybe it was the rhetoric that was the problem and not the algorithm. We don't know. But as I think about the goal of what do you want out of automatic summarization, one of the examples that comes up a lot is, could research work be summarized? And for some reason, the medical field always comes up in this context as well. A doctor who is in demand and doing their actual work doesn't have infinite time to read the literature, and so much of it's coming out. Wouldn't these summaries be great? But that's highly technical literature requiring a great deal of prior knowledge and background and training and context. I assume that's kind of futuristic for now. Given the state of the art today, where is automatic summarization useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there is an important distinction between, as you also said, like whatever works in practice and what we find in research is sometimes a little bit different, right? So theoretically, I would say if we have summarization systems that have been trained on news and we have a lot of news data, then we could produce good summaries about news, right? And this could be useful for readers of the news who just want to get like quick highlights, an overview of a news article, and might not want to read the entire news article, but might also want to read a bit more than just the summary. It can also be useful, for example, if you have like a chain of news events that are all connected to the same overall event. So then you might want to stay up to date with, what is new here, and have like a summarization of the timeline of whatever pops in. And then there is also, for example, a scientific document summarization. So basically what these papers look into is like, can you automatically generate the abstract of a scientific paper? Now, I'm not sure whether this is necessarily immediately useful as an applied task, but you can imagine that it's very important that you have systems that can summarize different types of domains.
Something that's always been in the back of my mind is the fact that on the internet we have these giant archives of PDF research documents, almost all of which begin with an abstract that you could consider as a summary of the later document. It would take a little work to extract all that, but it's very doable. Do corpora like that exist?
That's exactly how these data sets are constructed. Like there are big like archive and PubMed data sets. And what I like about it specifically is that in order to make a good summary, you need to have ideally at least a good understanding of the input. And that is not so trivial. As I just mentioned, that these models at this point still have this hallucination problem seems to be an indication that they don't fully understand what was their input, because otherwise you wouldn't say this football team won the match instead of the other. So it's a very interesting task if we want to look into how can we make models that understand text better.
So I'm aware that a human being can sometimes read an article and arrive at a conclusion that is not consistent with the data in that article. Is that kind of like the hallucination you're talking about, or is it something different with the machine?
Well, I guess maybe if you would give humans a text and then like get rid of the text and then ask them questions, you might get some factual errors, or if you ask like very advanced questions. But in general, I would say if you give humans a piece of text, like just a news article, nothing too fancy, and you would then with the news article next to them, ask them certain questions and they would be able to look it up or just make a summary, I don't think they would make these kind of factual inconsistencies as that we see that our models make. Maybe, of course, you will always have a few errors here and there, but not as much as we see in our models now.
So one of the main contributions of the paper is the survey you conducted. Can you talk a little bit about who the respondents were and what you learned from it?
So our main question in this paper was, so the majority of work focuses on text summarization to a smaller text summarization, which is great. Like we've seen a lot of progress there and it's proven to be super useful. That said, we had this gut feeling that this might not be the only way how you can make a summary. And I should add, like there is definitely also some work that does something differently than just simple text to simple text, but the vast body of work is like that. that. So from that motivation, we started this paper. Indeed, we decided to ask university students, as they make up for a good population, as they use a lot of like what we call pre-made summaries, so summaries that are made for them, not by themselves, for example, by teachers or fellow students or in the book they're reading, for example, exam preparations or essay writing or whatnot. And the overall question would be, what is a good summary? But we kind of split this up into multiple questions. So there are these three concepts from previous work, which are like the input factors, the purpose factors, and the output factors, which, the names are pretty much what they mean. So input factors look into like, what does the input document look like? Is it long? Is it short? Is it multiple documents or only a single document? These kinds of things. Then the purpose factors look into like, what is the goal of this summary, or what is the use case of this summary? And then we have the output factors, which look into like, what does the summary look like? Again, like, does it cover all the input material or only a bit? How is it structured? Is it only text, or does it also include images or tables or all these kinds of things? So we asked participants in our study questions to investigate these three factors. And what we found was that our gut feeling of maybe there is something more that we should focus our research on was confirmed, at least by what these participants in the study said.
Were there any consistent themes the respondents were in consensus about, or is it a lot of variety of opinions?
Some of it was consistent and others people had different opinions about, which I think is perfectly valid and only shows how many possibilities there are. So after writing this paper, I'm full of research ideas of what to do. It's like a joy to read and come up with new ideas that you can implement afterwards, because there are so many different opinions of what would be nice. And then if we look into like the input factors, these are actually the ones that are covered best by the current state of the art. So we do have like different types of domains, although it's mostly focused on news and Wikipedia and scientific documents. So there could definitely be some improvement there. But other than that, we're doing quite all right there. But if you then look at the purpose factors and the output factors, there stuff gets really interesting if you ask me. So one of the things, to come back to your question, like, how are the answers distributed? An interesting question I find is like, how did the summary help you with your task? And then we had different types of options. For example, to preview the material I was about to read, or to fully substitute it, or to refresh my memory, or to give an overview, etc., etc. And even though many people answered refresh memory or giving an overview, there were also many people who said, no, this is nice to preview the material or to substitute it entirely or to get an understanding. It's important to realize that there are many use cases for your summary, and maybe not every single summary is good for every single use case. So it's important to think about this. And I think we don't really do this enough in our current state of the field. And then maybe quickly about the output factors, two questions I really liked there was like, how is the summary structured, or how should it be structured? Because that links to what I said before, that often now we have a running piece of text, just a few sentences. But here, people gave many options, that it should include highlights or diagrams or tables or graphs or figures or headings and all these kinds of things. There is some work, like for example, multimodal summarization, but we don't do so much there. There are so many possibilities in that direction, which I think is really exciting. And the same for the style of the summary. So it was for students, so clearly they like an informative summary. For example, they had to study for an exam. But there are also other summary styles, like an aggregative style, where, for example, you have to pick parts from different documents and relate them to each other, which was also popular. And that's also a super interesting research area, because if we go back to the understanding of the document, then you really need to have a good understanding of your input if you want to be able to make all these kinds of relations. I think there are many, many ways to go forward from here.
I really like this framework, that there are factors about my input and factors about my output, like the length of the output might be something I want to control in certain ways, and also having that purpose, because I can imagine like a day trader type who wants a news summary that's financially focused versus a biographer who wants the details about the CEO or something along those lines. With such a wide spectrum of different demands on automatic summarization needs, do you think there'll be one underlying method that does all these things well, or a variety of techniques?
That's a great question. Future will tell, I guess. The interesting thing here is I think it depends on what your output is going to be. So maybe if your difference really is like, I only want a single sentence or multiple sentences as my summary, then you might use fairly similar systems with like just minor details to make sure that the one is one sentence and the other gives like multiple sentences. Like, for example, what I just said, where you really want to connect different documents to each other, you might actually need something else because just like a relatively simple sequence to sequence model might not do that by itself. But yeah, that said, it also depends on your motivation. Do you just want to solve the task and want to take the model that works best for your particular task at hand? Or do you rather want to solve it from a more kind of general point of view where you just want to have a model that should in principle be able to do any summarization task with some minor details when it comes to what the output looks like, maybe?
It seems to me that ultimately humans are the best evaluators of a summary because it really depends on what they want out of it. Can you talk a little bit about the role of human evaluation in your work?
Well, so first of all, we said like these purpose factors are really important to us. And that's like an important argument in our work. But if you say that, you also need to have a way to evaluate it. Like if you have a certain use case in mind, and you make a certain summary that you think is useful in that scenario, it'd be nice if you could evaluate this. But it's not so easy because like these standard automatic ways of evaluation that we discussed in the beginning don't work for usefulness, right? Like there's no lexical overlap that tells you whether a summary would be useful or not. And then there are other ways, like with human evaluation, where you might want to have humans perform a task, even though this might be able to measure usefulness. It's a lot of work and you might not really be able to find the right users in the right amount that can actually perform this task. So that's why we said we kind of want to have a human evaluation, but not as complicated as the one that I just described. So what we proposed is we said, okay, now imagine that we ask humans, like human evaluators, to have a certain task in mind, what they use the summary for. And this task is then the one you intend your summary for. And then, like, of course, humans should have some kind of familiarity with this task to be able to imagine it. And then you can compare two summaries and ask questions such as, which of these two summaries is more useful to you to review a document or to substitute this document that is useful for your particular task? And then you can actually get a bit of an idea of whether or not this summary that you made was useful for the task you had in mind.
Using humans as your source of data could introduce some problems. I guess they could be fatigued or they could misunderstand something or lack a certain context. Are there any techniques that are useful for refining the results you get back from the participants?
Yeah, so if you look at the evaluation now, and if you look at the human evaluation here, what you can do is small tricks to check what the quality of your data is. So for example, you can ask people to perform like a toy task that is kind of, you can check easily. If you already do this task, you can just as well do the actual task that was important. So for example, you can ask people like count the number of times the word such and such appears in this text, right? This is quite a cognitive load for people and you know the answer, so you can check whether or not this answer was correct and hence whether or not you should discard the answer of the rest of the questions that users gave. So these kinds of tricks you can do to have a bit of an idea of how well the users are paying attention when they are labeling your data or evaluating your data.
What's the impact of data sets on automated summarization research?
This is really important because as we discussed before, like for example, in the new summarization where we know there is a bias towards the beginning of the text when it comes to the important information or where the important information is positioned, if you use a model that is trained on news and you use this for something else, well, then you're going to have a bit of an issue that it's out of domain. So your model might not fully understand the topic in the first place, but your model is probably also going to have a bias towards the beginning of the text. text. And this might not apply to every single domain, or will probably most surely not apply to every single domain. And then there are all kinds of other types of bias that you should take into account. So it's extremely important to use the right data for the right task. And whether this is you want to use as much data as available, right, for many domains, or you maybe want to train a model that is very specific to a domain, I guess these are different approaches that you can take. And then, of course, you also need to take all kinds of societal biases into account, right? So it's extremely important to really take care when you collect the data set.
I think a little bit about research and reproducibility. I'm curious if you think it would be useful for some sort of taxonomy of like purpose IDs to be assigned that could be shared across different projects.
Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about this because on the one hand, I think taking it a bit more on a general level, what is nice about all these community-based standards is that everyone is using them, right? So it's easy to compare different types of work. The same holds for leaderboards, for example, like with Rouge in the case of summarization and like all kinds of other tasks. However, this has the disadvantage, I think, that in many times it's questionable whether people are still solving the problem or want to be on top of the leaderboard, no matter what it takes. Now, I should say no matter what it takes, that may sound a bit negative, but it's not always the best to purely optimize for a certain score, right? Like that doesn't necessarily mean that your model now performs well if it's like tried on data from a slightly different distribution. So I think you need to be careful with that. Like on the one hand, it's good because there are standards and you can be held accountable. And on the other hand, you might forget the goal and go too hard in the direction of the leaderboard and forget what you actually wanted to solve.
What are some research directions you're excited about for the future?
I think especially the results that we had on the output vectors give a lot of directions for people to work on, much more than I or we could work on alone. I'm really hopeful that many other people pick this up. There are so many directions going into from adding more structure to the summaries as to make these links between multiple documents that I've said, to more research onto multimodal summarization, etc., etc. So I'm really excited to see what comes out there. And yeah, that's also definitely one of the directions that I'll be working on, and I am working on at this point.
Well, to wrap up, I'd like to ask you something speculative. When, if ever, do you think we might have an algorithm that could pass a sort of Turing test for automatic summarization in which a human judge wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a machine-generated or human-generated summary?
I think that depends on whether or not we will take these factual inconsistencies into account. Because when it purely comes to text and fluency, I think we're extremely far at this point. So that wouldn't take too long anymore if we're not already there. That said, these factual inconsistencies are a big problem, but at the same time, an exciting problem, because I think at this point we're at a crossroad. Like, do we want to go into the same directions with these huge language models that have been super promising, but also kind of give us these weird issues? Or do we need, again, another paradigm shift and go into a different direction, or maybe like combine these two? So I'm very excited to be in this field at this time and to see where we're going. But I'm actually hopeful that we will be quite far in the near future.
Where can people follow you online?
You can follow me on Twitter, which is at Maartje ter Hoeve. Maybe a bit hard to understand for anyone who's not Dutch, but I'm sure it'll be in the show notes.
That's right, yep.
Yeah, that's the best way. I mean, you can always send me an email, but Twitter is a great place.
That concludes this installment of Data Skeptic Consensus. Our guest this week was Marjan ter Hoeve. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer, Vanessa Burciaga does guest coordination, and I've been your host, Kyle Polich.